A deeply unpopular Olympic Games. A shock resignation. And a deadly fifth wave of COVID-19 infections.
ですね、いろいろ見てきて、正直なんか日本は三流の国になったなっていうのをすごく感じました。
ある種の悔しさともなんかもうどうしようもないことがあったんで。
Yet amidst unhappiness, Japan's government calls for snap elections.
それからもう一つはですね、そういうだから正体が明らかにならない前にやってしまいたいということと、
今下がっているタイミングで、できるだけ早く。
It's almost certain that the ruling party will win this election. But while they take the seat of power, what will it take to win back the hearts of an embattled population?
「その声を広げていただきまして、合わせて比例には公明党さん、こうした形でこの与党自民党公明党の皆さんの結束が我々の生活を良くする、そう信じてご活動いただければと思います。
October 2021.
日本共産党池内沙織候補にこの東京12区ではぜひ大きなお力添えで国会へ押し上げてください。日本共産党現在2議席ですが、これを3議席、4議席へと大きく議席を伸ばしてください。
Six main parties are jostling for seats in Japan's powerful lower house of representatives.
安倍司、ここ菅も自動通り商店街を含む東京第12区で衆議院選挙に立候補しております。ぜひとも皆様のお力添え、何卒。
There's not much time. Parliament was dissolved on October 14, leaving parties with only 17 days till polling day, scheduled for October 31st. Tracking the breathless pace of this election is 47-year-old Daisuke Suda. A journalist in Tokyo, he runs his own political news channel, Politas TV.
投票率がね、今回高くなるのか低くなるのかっていうところを込みで、じゃあ一体何が争点の選挙なんだろう、政権交代ってあるのかなと。政権交代ないにしても、じゃあ自民党がどれだけ勝つのか、それとも負けるのか、野党は伸びるのか。
The last time Japan went to the polls was in 2017. The issues then were a missile threat from North Korea and tax hikes. This time round, while the economy remains a top issue for voters, other concerns have come into play.
賃金っていうのも下がり続けてますし、この本当に20年30年経済的に厳しくなってきているという、生活実感っていうのが厳しい人が増えている、本当に格差もね増大してますから、そういう中で、自分たちが今後もねきちんと暮らし向きが良くなるのかっていうことが、生活のやっぱり、政治に求める期待するすごく大きなイシューになっていて、で他方でまたじゃあコロナの問題でいうと、コロナっていうのはもちろん公衆衛生あるいは自分の健康の問題っていう意味でも重要ではあるんですけれども、同時にこれ経済問題でもありますよね。コロナによって自分のやっぱり仕事に自分の所属する会社の売り上げが下がった、あるいは非正規の方だったらそれで職が失われた、あるいはコロナのおかげで例えば日常的に我々マスクとか買わなきゃいけなくなりましたから、そういう意味での出費が増大するっていう、やっぱり実はコロナも経済問題としての視点っていうのがあるので、だから多分コロナに関しても。
So with the double whammy of a weak economy and a persistent pandemic, why did the ruling party choose now to call for election? Speculation for when the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, was going to call for election had been going on for a while. In fact, Daisuke had expected the election to be called only in early November.
ずっとこの夏から、コロナ対策がね後手後手に回ってしまったっていうこともあって自民党の支持率が下がり続けていたので、その下がった状態で選挙を行うと自民党は大敗してしまうっていうことで、できるだけ後ろ倒しにしようと思って、で結局じゃあなんで急に早まったのかっていうと、この9月に入ってから急速に新型コロナの感染者数が減ってきましたから、そうするとこの今度はね後ろ倒しにしておくと、また冬が近づいてコロナの感染者数が増えていくと、それが支持率とも直結してしまうので支持率が下落してしまうんじゃないかということで、今下がっているタイミングでできるだけ早くやりたいという、そういった思惑もあるので。
I think this is kind of surprise attack. Kishida-san tried not to give much time for fragmented oppositions to get united for the election front by accelerating election to 2 weeks than we had expected.
Another reason is this man, Fumio Kishida, Japan's newly minted Prime Minister. Kishida took the top spot in LDP after a party leadership race in September.
It was a close race. The first round ended with just one vote between Mr. Kishida and Vaccine Minister Taro Kono, who was the favorite for the top job. Mr. Kishida succeeds Yoshihide Suga, who is stepping down after a year in office.
もともとその腰の強い人じゃないので、だから結局また派閥の論理でバババってそういう人たちが全部揃うだけになってしまうんで、全然そこは期待できないですし。
Kono-san is very popular among general public because sometimes he fearlessly attack fellow LDP parliamentarians, even senior parliamentarians of same party. So that was the dangerous game in order to gain the popularity. Under the presidential system, Kono-san might win the leadership. But under the cabinet parliament system, you need a support from fellow LDP parliamentarians.
On October 4th, Mr. Kishida was formally appointed as Japan's 100th Prime Minister.
岸田文雄の特技は人の話をしっかり聞くということであります。ぜひ皆さんと一緒に開かれた自民党、そして明るい日本の未来を目指して努力をする覚悟であります。
So Kishida-san has a longer career enough to make friends inside the party. So he has a solid base. He has a longer career, enough time to make friends. And although he is not super popular among the party, but Kishida-san has no enemy. That's the reason why he could win over Kono-san.
Mr. Kishida, who is able to aggregate the different interests of different factions within the party. They believe that his centrist platform best represents the optimal balance of these factional interests. The party elders within the party believe that he can best navigate Japan through a very complex period of time with the coronavirus pandemic recovery period and its accompanying economic recovery and also an equilibrium imbalance between the ironclad alliance with the US as well as China as a major trading partner and also other major important players in the region like ASEAN and also European Union as well.
While the LDP is often seen as conservative, it does not have a unified ideology. Instead, the party is broken up into various factions, each with their own agenda. The LDP currently has 5 major factions. They range from being very conservative to liberal left-leaning. The largest faction in the LDP is the party's most conservative and nationalistic faction. It includes former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Japan's new Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, leads one of the smaller factions and tends to be more dovish.
自民党のね総裁選4候補いましたけれども、じゃあなぜ岸田さんが選ばれたのかっていうと、一番岸田さんが無難だからっていう理由で岸田さんやね。
Backing Japan's new Prime Minister is Anri Komiya. She has been with the LDP for 22 years, almost as long as Mr. Kishida has been in the party.
岸田さんはお人柄としてやはり言えるのはとっても誠実真面目な方です。で、リーダーシップっていう点で言いますと、やはりその岸田総理がよくおっしゃってますけれども、一人一人の声を丁寧に大切に聞くと、岸田新総理の売りであり魅力でありリーダーシップであるかなと。
Prime Minister Kishida is hoping to capitalize on his newly minted status as Prime Minister and a honeymoon period to sway voters to stick to the ruling party. But will Mr. Kishida be able to shake off the unpopularity of his predecessor? Prime Minister Kishida's ascent to the top position in Japan comes after a leadership vacuum in the LDP. In September, then Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga suddenly announced that he would not be participating in the LDP leadership election. This meant he was giving up his premiership job, having been in it for just a year. Although it was a disappointing year.
His decision paves the way for a new PM after just 1 year in office. Mr. Suga says that he wants to focus instead on fighting the pandemic.
このコロナ対策と選挙活動、こうしたことを考えたときに、実際、莫大なエネルギーがこれ必要でありました。そういう中で、やはり両立はできない、どちらかに選択すべきである。国民の皆さんにお約束を何回ともしています。新型コロナウイルス、この感染拡大を防止するために私は専任をしたい、そういう判断をいたしました。
直前まで当然のように総裁選に出るんだったら、降りたかっていうような感じのショックというか、ちょっと筋書きが読めないという感じと、我々私たちの映画からすると、主演が降りてしまったという、その
日本の未来はこの男に託された。菅義偉、空手の達人であり、叩き上げの苦労人と呼ばれているが、
This documentary is called Tasting the Pancake for Poison. Pancakes are Suga's favorite food.
出せない首相の素顔に迫るドキュメンタリーである。
国丸ごと非物化するんじゃないかと。議論が噛み合っていない。
It is directed by Taketo Uchiyama and it tracks the rise and fall of Mr. Suga's scandal-ridden career.
彼らはすぐ忘れてくれるから。
官僚たちの話聞くと菅さんのことはバカにしてるんですよ。はいは頭から腐る。
パンケーキを毒味する。
And one scandal really got the public riled up. Late last year, Japan was experiencing a spike in infections, and the government had warned people not to dine in large groups. Yet, the Prime Minister was caught doing precisely that.
去年の12月に菅さんが王貞治杉良太郎あたりと一緒に15人ほどで会食をしたというの、これは
確かにその時はもうみんなが自粛しなきゃって言って結構みんなで自粛モードに入ったっていう直後にこれが出たので、結局言い出した人たちがこんな感じっていうので、いわゆるこういう高い人たちは許されるのかというようなことが庶民感情として一気に盛り上がったこともありましたね。
Other scandals implicating the former Prime Minister include his rejection of nominees for a top science panel without explaining why, and ministry officials being treated to a lavish dinner by a company which Suga's son is part of. All that led to mounting disapproval from both outside and within the party. With Suga stepping aside, This has worked to the LDP's advantage.
その時のこのまま菅首相でこの支持率のまま選挙に突入すれば過半数割れをすることもかなり現実味があるということを言われていました。菅さんが辞めたことで菅さんの支持率も回復しましたし、また自民党への支持率、政党支持率もかなり上がったんですよね。それぐらいトップの顔を変えたことに劇的な効果があったということは言えると思います。
But even without Suga's resignation, the LDP still has a strong chance of winning.
The LDP itself is a moderate center-right party. It consists of many factions that range from liberal left to the right-leaning, even conservative factions. Therefore, with this wide spectrum of factional interests within the party, it represents the cross-section of the society. It has also led Japan with a good track record, having led Japan from post-war period recovery to fast growth in the 1960s, and Japan becoming the third largest economy by end 1970s. Currently, barring any black swans, ruling party will probably be able to preserve its majority within the parliament.
でところがやっぱり野党の側はやはり基本的にはどんどん分裂を繰り返して出てきたっていうこともあるので、そういうやっぱりウイングの広さっていうのもあまりないということ、そしてまた野党が野党でひとまとまりにやっぱりなれないですよね。
However, this does not mean the opposition is giving up. There are 4 main opposition parties contesting in the upcoming elections. But the 2 biggest ones are the Constitutional Democratic Party and the Japanese Communist Party, or JCP. Despite its name, the JCP is more of a left-wing or left-center party.
政権交代選挙に持ち込んでいく歴史上初めての政策と、要するに候補者の一致ということを掲げましたから、万全に臨むことができるというふうに申し上げていいと思います。
Up for grabs in this election are 465 seats in the powerful lower house of representatives. Of the 465 seats, the LDP currently controls 276 seats. In the upcoming elections, the ruling party is hoping to retain a simple majority by winning at least 233 seats this time. But retaining a majority is not the challenge the LDP really faces. It is the impending challenge of quelling the disquiet and anger brewing in Japanese society.
The International Olympic Committee has the honor of announcing that the games of the 32nd Olympiad in 2020 are awarded to the city of Tokyo.
In 2013, Tokyo had just won the bid for the 2020 Summer Olympic Games. The country saw the Games as a chance to rebuild from the devastating earthquake, tsunami, and the Fukushima nuclear disaster that happened only 2 years earlier.
Positive one is, at the time, Japan was trying hard to invite more international travelers to boost inbound tourism. I thought having such a big international sports event can be a catalyst to boost the inbound tourism.
2013年にオリンピックが決まってから、全てのですねスポーツが、アスリートだけではなくてスタッフ、そういった人たち全てが競技力向上メダルを取るっていうことを目標にやってきたので、おそらくその成果があったというふうに思います。
The games were said to originally cost $7.5 billion. However, by 2019, the budget ballooned to $12.6 billion due to building delays and venue issues.
コストに関してももっと少ない予算でやるはずだったんです。もともと整備あるで日本東京はできてたわけだから、それを完全に哲学を忘れてしまって頭の古臭い人たちだけやってしまった、もう本当に年狂ったオリンピックになってしまったっていう印象ですよね。こんなにお金をかけてる。
Tokyo already had existing facilities, such as the Tokyo Tatsumi International Swimming Center. Yet, $500 million was spent on building the enormous 15,000-seat Tokyo Aquatic Center. Another $1.4 billion was spent on a new national stadium, even though Japan already had existing stadiums such as the Tokyo Dome and the Yokohama Arena.
僕新しいオリンピックを提案した方、予算をかけずにありものだけで、あるいはちょっとリニューアルするだけですごく少ないコストで、しかも残るものが多くて、しかも同時にアピールするもの、要するに自然を豊かに見せることとか、距離が近いことであるとか、あるいはちょっとした道路とかちょっとした整備だけでこんだけ豊かなお客様を迎えつつ豊かなオリンピックができるよという意味でのオリンピックができるんじゃないかっていうで、新しい技術とかそういったものを見せる意味でのオリンピックとしては面白かったかもしれないけど、結局それが何十倍にも増えてきて、で結果また箱物みたいなものをバンバン増やすっていうのが。
To add to Japan's Olympic spending woes, in 2020, the pandemic struck.
Today would have been the eve of the 2020 Summer Olympics in Tokyo. COVID-19 has meant that organizers have had to reset the clock, though, and so now another one-year countdown begins.
That postponement cost an additional $2.8 billion. All that made the Tokyo Games the most expensive Summer Olympics on record.
They try to cut the spending, but COVID happens. The leadership at the time was first Abe-san, then Suga-san. They are preoccupied by controlling COVID, and they had two minds: hosting or not hosting, which is better for the election, which is better for the popularity, which is better for the economy. So they couldn't have enough focus to cut down the cost.
Japan had hoped to recoup some of its losses through spectator revenue. Ticket sales for the Games were expected to bring in some $800 million. But that did not happen.
Officials don't want the Summer Games in July and August to be a super spreader event. So they've barred foreign spectators, a decision local businesses are struggling to come to terms with.
無観客にしたことによって1700億円程度、収入が減ってしまった可能性があります。で、そうするとその分は赤字になるので、チケット収入は本来は全て組織委員会の収入になるはずだったんですけど、それがなくなるのでそこが赤字になる。で、赤字分は東京都が埋める形だと思いますので、東京都民の負担になってくる可能性があると思いますね。
The final costs of the Olympics have yet to be tallied, but the Games have also come at another expense: the country's health. For months in the lead-up to the Olympics, protesters have been taking to the streets. They want the Games cancelled, and for good reason.
So far, only about 2.3 million people in Japan have been fully vaccinated. Until last week, only Pfizer was available. Moderna and AstraZeneca vaccines were only added on Friday.
In the lead-up to the Games, only around 7% of Tokyo residents were fully vaccinated. Nationally, only 20%. Japan had procured the largest amount of vaccine doses of any country in Asia, more than 300 million. So how did this happen?
やっぱりネットはちょっとできないですから、私が全部やって。
A flawed booking system and a lack of manpower meant the country's vaccination drive was off to a slow start. This is the nighttime vaccination center at the Minato ward in Tokyo. Here, a mismatch of supplies resulted in some citizens missing their vaccination.
ワクチンの供給量が毎週毎週不安になるという、ここをちゃんと供給量を明確にしてもらうっていうんですかね、それがあればよかったなというふうに思います。
毎週毎週確定していないということですか？
そうですね。先々が読めないというんですかね。ちょっと先は分かるんですけども、やはりその先ってなると1ヶ月先とか2ヶ月先に区民の数分だけのワクチンが本当に来るのかどうかというのが結構分からない状態が続いているので、そこはおそらく港区もそうですけども他の自治体もなかなか進まない理由の一つとして、予約を受け付けたけどもワクチンが間に合わないのでキャンセルするなんていうこともある区があるって聞いてます。港区は幸いそういったことはなかったですけども。
真面目である点は一緒なんだけれども、伝える力がなかなか残念ながら乏しいと申し上げてよろしいのかどうかですけれども、そういった違いはあろうかと思います。
But even with Japan nowhere near its vaccination target, the government had to push ahead with the games. Substantial investments had already been poured into building the various sporting venues. Japan also had a binding contract with the IOC sharing some of the costs of the games. Breaking the contract would have resulted in financial penalties.
The games cannot be unilaterally cancelled by Japan or the city of Tokyo. The Olympics contract states very clearly that games can only be cancelled in the times of war or very severe civil strife. If Japan or the city of Tokyo unilaterally cancels the game, it has to bear all the responsibility, including financial ones, upon itself.
August 8th, the closing ceremony of the Olympics. It was a moment of pride for Japan. The country had clinched 27 gold medals. It was the greatest number of gold medals Japan has ever won. Proud of Japan's success at the Games is Kaori Yamaguchi, a former judo champion and former Japanese Olympic Committee board member.
おそらくその成果があったというふうに思います。また地元の利というかやはりコンディションの面とかそういったところでも有利なところもあったと思うので、選手たちは非常に頑張ったと思います。
オリンピック時代は成功か不成功かってことで言えばどう考えてもやんなきゃよかったっていうふうに結果いくらかの金メダルがあってなんかちょっと素敵な思い出もできたかもしれないけど、それとこれで失うもので言ったらほぼ間違いなく失うものが多かった。ただそれは全て政権が選んでしまったこの間違った選択によってなってるっていうのは思いますよね。コロナがちゃんと抑えきれてさえいればこんなことになってなかったわけですからね、その前の段階で。
The period during the Games saw a sharp increase in number of COVID-19 infections. A fifth wave of infections soon formed. Tokyo started recording thousands of infections every day.
これ1回目。でもやっぱこんなもんなんだ。ええ。東京の方なんですけど、東京はそういう検査できるクリニックがないので、ちょっと症状が悪かったんですけど、自費で検査してやっぱり。ここに来たの？これは浜松町の自費センターに。なるほど。川口の方です。川口の方。
This is Kuramochi Clinic in Park. It's a respiratory clinic in a city north of Tokyo. It used to see around 80 patients a day. Now, on average, 300 patients.
患者さんはいないんですもんね。で、入院も明日の入院とかってのはもうロナップリーブは決まったんですか？
Dr. Kuramochi is the medical director of the clinic. He has been a doctor for 23 years, but this is the busiest he has ever been.
第5波の波っていうのは今までにない最大の波になってしまったんですね。それから入院病床も常に満床で、満床の中ベッドを回し続けながら、そして、毎日スタッフは夜中までっていう形で、昼ご飯もろくに取れない状況のまま、次から次へと患者さんに追われていたと。
Despite the sharp increase in infection during the Games, the government has ruled out a link in the rise of infections to holding the Games. However, Dr. Kuramochi disagrees.
人の動きを加速させるようなイベントをですね、これ残念ながら同時にやってしまったっていうところが大失敗でして、今の段階で関係あるないっていうことはすぐ結論付けることは正直難しいんですが、データ集めもしてないのにエビデンスがあるとかないとかっていうのは無責任なことになってしまうと思うんですが、
オリンピックっていうのはすごく大きなイベントなので、私たち日本人も興奮してですね、気持ちがどうしてもその感染対策というよりは少し感染対策よりも楽しむこととか気が緩むっていうんですかね、そういったことがもしかしたら感染拡大につながった可能性は当然あると思います。
コロナがちゃんと抑えきれてさえいればこんなことになってなかったわけですからね、その前の段階で。
Japan's fifth wave of infections saw almost 900,000 people getting sick. That is more than double the infections of Japan's fourth wave of infections. With hospitals quickly filling up, patients were left with nowhere to go. One ambulance was even stuck for 2 hours without a hospital to transport a patient to.
5波を迎えてしまったんですが、当時の菅総理あるいはその前の安倍総理の政権からですね、やはりそのコロナに対する戦略というのが基本的には重症者のみを検査をして重症者のみを隔離して治療すれば感染拡大はしないんだというスタンスを貫いてきてしまったんですね。ですから重症者だけを見て重症者だけをケアすれば、そして根本的には長期的な視点を持っていなかったので
いうことで、現に PCR 検査で早く早期に患者さんを見つけて、そして保護すると、で他にうつらないように進めていくと、感染症対策で言えばね、早期発見早期治療というのが一番の鉄則ですよね。それを全くやらなかった、その医療崩壊するという理由で PCR 検査をずっとサボってきたと、これは一つある。
Japan had favored a strategy of only testing clusters of people that had come in contact with positive cases, rather than mass testing, which was used by many other countries. This resulted in many cases going undetected. Dissatisfied with the government's handling of the pandemic, the public made its feelings known. Approval ratings for Prime Minister Suga's cabinet plummeted to 30%, the lowest cabinet rating since 2012. Since then, public confidence has yet to improve.
いろいろ見てきて、正直なんか日本は三流の国になったなっていうのをすごく感じました。例えば、検査体制ですとか、それからワクチンの接種についてとか、本当に先進国とは思えないようなですね、いろいろなうまくいかないことだったり後手に回ったことっていうのがあまりにも多くて、でやっぱりそれを分かっているんだろうかっていう政府がですね。
The government had assumed that fewer cases would emerge because of the progress of vaccinations among the elderly. The crisis management system was also lacking. Coronavirus policies, infection prevention measures, and financial support were spread across multiple ministries and agencies. This meant there was no central decision-making body to comprehensively manage the government's direction.
Moving forward, Mr. Kishida will probably need to prove his policies work after winning the elections, and also be able to put in some measures that can help Japan move up the curve in economic recovery after the pandemic.
Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party is likely to retain its majority in the upcoming election. But the new administration will have its work cut out for it trying to move Japan out of the pandemic. The previous government had promised that Japan will be completely vaccinated by November. It's now end of October. The percentage of Japan fully inoculated? Only 70%. At the Minato ward in Tokyo, the vaccination rate is a laudable 75%, a figure above the national average. But that still leaves a sizable portion of the ward unvaccinated. To get more people vaccinated, this nighttime vaccination center has been set up.
しっかり打っていただくためには新しい仕組みとして、その時間ということに着目し、これまでになかったこういった深夜までの接種の時間帯を設けることにしました。特に港区はもう大丈夫だと思うんですけども、まだワクチン供給が現時点で厳しいところも、予約を受け付けたけどもワクチンが間に合わないのでキャンセルするなんていうこともある区があるって聞いています。港区は幸いそういったことはなかったですけども。
The central government will have to ensure that the different cities and wards continue to receive a steady supply of vaccines in a timely manner. To achieve that, better communication between the central and municipal government is required. With the winter season approaching, some fear that a sixth wave of infections might happen. To prevent the hospital system from being overwhelmed again, the government needs to strengthen its medical system.
ワクチンだけでは解決できません。PCR 検査だけでも解決できません。でもそこには外来の診療体制や入院設備の増強ということをしていくことで対応ができるということが分かってきたんですが。
Besides handling the pandemic, helping the world's third largest economy recover remains a top issue during this election. During the pandemic, the government declared a state of emergency to curb the rise in infections. Under these emergency measures, businesses were restricted. In Tokyo, major commercial facilities were obligated to close by 8 p.m. Attendance at large events was capped at 5,000 people or 50% of a venue's capacity, whichever is fewer. Food service establishments were prohibited from serving alcohol and required to close by 8 p.m. One of the many businesses that were struggling under these measures is Banpaiya. It's a chain of budget-friendly izakaya restaurants.
今年に入ってからというのはもう時短だけでなく一切の営業の停止という時期が続いておりましたので、売上についても当然そこに付随する利益についても雇用についてもですね、甚大な影響があったと言わざるを得ないかなと思います。そうですね、まずですね、オフィスの移転につきましては今年の2020年の3月に実施をいたしました。もともとは物流拠点と、セントラルキッチン機能を持った、工場であり本社をですね、品川区に借りてはいたんですけども、見通しが立たない中、また売上が下がっていく中でですね、非常に固定費として重いパイを占めていましたので、そこを移転してですね、今はこちらバンパイアの大森店のですね、3階にオフィスをお引っ越ししてですね、働いております。
These days, however, things are getting better. With the fall in infection, the state of emergency has been lifted.
Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga has approved the move as the country sees a steady decline in new infections. Now, he says, thanks to vaccinations, the strain on medical systems has also eased.
This means eateries will now be allowed to serve alcohol and open past 8 p.m, provided antivirus measures are taken. In the last month or so, Banpaya has opened again, but is only earning about 60% of what it used to.
For Japan to recover pre-pandemic levels of economic output, it really needs to see a recovery in services. So services like anything travel related, again, accommodation, transport, but also more day-to-day, more day-to-day things like eating out, dining out, that sort of thing. Spending on services makes up 60% of household spending in Japan. And household consumption spending, in turn, makes up the vast majority of economic output in Japan, at more than 50%.
To stimulate spending, Prime Minister Kishida has promised to compile a stimulus plan after the elections. The plan would include cash payment programs, but other details have been lacking.
If Kishida does focus on households of lower and middle income, we know those sorts of households have a higher propensity to consume out of income, which just means that for each additional yen in income that they make, they tend to spend more money on day-to-day needs, on education and the like. So in that respect, the economy benefits as well.
The ruling LDP's handling of the pandemic has left the public frustrated. And while this election is probably more about rebuilding the trust between the ruling party and the people, perhaps what the public wants most of all is the construction of a viable and credible opposition in the long run.
見通しは暗いと思っています。唯一の望みは今度こそ野党が結束してくれれば多少はなんとかなるかと思うんですが。
There are 4 main opposition parties contesting in this election. In the previous lower house election in 2017, the now defunct Democratic Party, the main opposition at the time, split right before the campaign period kicked off. Opposition forces fell out of step. As a result, they allowed the long-running reign of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's administration to continue. This time round, opposition parties remain divided.
The opposition parties are currently still in a disarray. They do not have great unity at the moment, and they do have different platforms that may not be entirely complementary. Whereas the LDP has a coherent strategy and a platform to lead Japan at the moment.
将来に不安を抱えている人の受け皿に野党がなっていないということ、将来に不安を抱えている人が急激に変えることでもっとひどくなるぐらいだったら現状維持を選ぶっていうこと、価値観みたいなものっていうのはどんどん多分多様リベラルな側になっていくでしょうから、そういうものをきちんと受け皿になるようなひとまとまりになる野党を長い時間かけて作っていくっていうことでしか日本の政治状況が健全化することはないのかなっていうことは思っています。
As Japan continues on its road to recovery, the path ahead is filled with uncertainty. A deadlier variant could emerge, and a resurgence of infections could happen. The government would then be forced to take measures that would hurt the economy and people's livelihoods. Before that happens, Japan needs to strengthen its medical system, improve its vaccination rate, or risk squandering whatever little respite the country has now.